Power for triathletes. I am Tim Snow with QT2 Systems, and I am somebody who, after running, I bumped into running with power kind of in an accidental way, and it has transformed my relationship with running. I'm an athlete who has been running competitively since about 13, and after 30 years of running, it wasn't until I started running with power that I really started to think about running in a very different way. And so I've gone down a pretty decent rabbit hole in trying to learn as much about power as I can. I have not learned everything there is to learn quite yet, but it has resulted in me reading 2.5 books. I'm not quite all the way through the third book just yet, on running with power, and I have now been running with it for probably about 2 years now, and I encourage as many of my athletes when I take them on to run with power as well. In fact, I've come to a point where if I'm speaking with a potential athlete who I'm going to coach, one of my I guess soft requirements, I would say, is that they adopt running with power with me, and I of course will guide them to that. And this is just kind of a beginner's guide and kind of getting to know running with power as a triathlete. So what is running with power? Running with power is just very similar-ish, I would say, to biking with power. It's a real-time measure of intensity as a function of speed, form, elevation change, and wind speed. Right now, the best thing on the market that is available is the Stride Power Meter. It is the industry leader. It is this guy at the upper right. It is a foot pod that goes on the shoe. Okay, it has it measures power through accelerometers, and it measures power in 3-dimensional space. Okay, and this is a lot of what kind of changed the way that I started to think about running. Was it measures running from the sense of having, and I'm down at the bottom right corner. I'm looking at this runner here. When we run, we are running through our running has a vertical, a horizontal component as designated by the red arrow, a vertical component, our foot, as designated by the blue arrow, and then a rotational component. Okay, and power, in very simplistic terms, very simplistic terms, is the summation, say, of those 3 dimensions of running. Okay, what we do in a horizontal plane, what we do in a vertical plane, and what we do rotationally. Okay, so that is in the Stride. The Stride is the industry leader at this time in measuring that thing. Okay, the beauty of power, training and racing with power, is that it just like riding with power, it takes away, it measures effort in real time. So as soon as you put out effort, you can view it on your watch, your Garmin, to see exactly how much effort you are putting out. It makes it so that an athlete can very easily translate a road run over into a trail run, or a running on flat terrain into running on hilly terrain. It in a way serves as, if heart rate was kind of our initial way to measure running intensity, and then as Garmin's became, everybody got Garmin's, and we were able to measure running intensity through say a physiologically superior method, which was pace. Running with power has taken that and evolved it to something that's even more superior. Okay, and within QT2, I have in some of the books that I or a couple of books that I have read, I have actually adopted the running zones of Jim Vance created. Okay, a great professional coach based out in San Diego. Great guy. He wrote a book, an excellent book about running with power, and I have, for the most part, adopted most of his training zones of power. But I just want to go through that real quick. So on the bike and the run, so just a glossary of terms real quick. FTP is a functional threshold power, okay? And that's how we usually talk about bike power. And that is defined as what is the maximal power that you can maintain for an hour, 60 minutes, okay? Our FTP, which is really running FTP, what is the maximal wattage that you can maintain on the run for an hour? Then we have our zone R, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. Those are our QT2 zones, okay? And I've defined those over on the table to the right. So on the bike, our zone R has always been about less than 65% of our bike FTP. Zone 1 is defined as 65 to 79% of FTP. Zone 2, 79 to 89% of FTP. And zone 3, 89 to 100% of FTP. On the run, it's just slightly different, okay? Where our zone R is defined as 70 to 80% of running FTP, our FTP. So running FTP and biking FTP will be very different numbers typically. And we'll talk about how to determine those later. Zone 1 is defined as 80 to 80% of running FTP. Zone 2, 88 to 95% of running FTP. In zone 3, 95 to 105% of running FTP. And just a note on the zone 3 running is I sometimes have felt, and while I adopted Jim's zones, these are exactly defined as defined by Jim Vance, and these are actually outlined within Training Peaks. I have found that maybe on the zone 3, which is we define as kind of sub-threshold, typically in QT2, the portion of Jim's zone 3, which is above the 100%, 100 to 105%, can sometimes be a little juicy for maybe what we would prefer. And I will typically only use that for very short intervals, the 100 to 105% of run FTP. And just a note on the zones, I have come to discover over the winter months in training a number of athletes who are using stride power meters that when we are running on, say on a treadmill because of the unfortunate winter weather, that we have needed to, and this took a little bit of trial and error to understand and realize. Also, with myself running, that we need to reduce our running zones on the treadmill by about 3 to 5%. I call it the treadmill factor. Essentially, if what we have found is athletes who are trying to maintain the zones as defined in this right column, the running zones on a treadmill, end up running significantly, well, not significantly, but that's a heavy word. They end up running a bit harder than they really should be. The effort is a bit too much. There's just something different about running on a treadmill in the way that you generate power versus how you run outdoors. And I'll probably talk a little bit about that later on. But anytime that you're running, if you end up training with power and you have a certain, let's say that your zone 1 on a treadmill, outdoors, is 200 to 230 watts, just making some numbers up. I'll typically ask athletes to reduce that by about 5% when they bring it indoors on the treadmill. So instead of 200 to 230, we'll do what would that be, about 190 to about 220 in that range, okay? And that just dials it down a hair. We were finding athletes who were trying, and myself included, who were trying to maintain these wattage zones on the treadmill were able to do so. They absolutely were able to do so, but they were getting beat up. And there was another number, metric, a power metric that I'll speak to a bit later, that was indicating that something was off relative to running outdoors. So this is the how we define intensity, and I'm just going to go through now a series of how these workouts have been defined within the QT2 workout libraries, library of workouts. Sorry. So here is a typical Zone R run. It is defined as 65 to 75% of FTP. I actually allow it to go up to 65 to 80% of FTP. And down here, and this is for an athlete who it has an FTP of say 300 and a run FTP, a run FTP of about 338 watts, 340 watts. This athlete's Zone R recovery running wattage would be 220 to about 254 watts. And so this athlete, no matter what is going on, they go out and they would run, and they can the power meter will tell them exactly what their intensity is at the time that they're running. And so it does a really nice job of defining intensity and making sure that whatever intensity you're doing is appropriate. Okay. A Zone 1 run, I typically, so the red is really what I consider to be the Zone 1 portion of a run. Remember, I defined Zone 1 as being 80 to 88% of run FTP. And in our workout library, we have broken up Zone 1 into 3 sections. I have a very initial kind of get rolling piece here. But once the Zone 1 running begins, we would progress from 271 watts to 281 watts, then 281 to 292 watts, 292 to about 298 watts. And that's what a nice progressive Zone 1 run does. And typically in QT2 philosophies and QT2 outrival run formula, all of our philosophies have always been to quote unquote get faster as we go. The idea to build intensity throughout a run, and what wattage does a very nice job of allowing us to do that. Okay, and you can see exactly how it's spelled out. So this is kind of the theory of how it's built here in the red. Okay, and this is what it would be in the blue for a specific athlete. Once pulled into Training Peaks and defined for an athlete's run, their 40-minute run would be defined very specifically in this way. And the nice thing about these is these workouts are being pulled directly into the athlete's watch. So as athletes are running along, after this initial 3-minute segment, they enter into a 7-minute segment, and the watch is telling them, okay, spend the next 7 minutes running between 270 and 280 watts. Zone 2, again, here in the red, we have our 3-sectioned Zone 1. The Zone 1 portion of the run broken out into 3 sections: low, middle, high. And then we have, this is a Zone 1, Zone 2 run, really what I call Zone 1 run with a last mile at Zone 2, some portion of the run at Zone 2. And then it very nicely allows us to section out and say, okay, you've run at Zone 1 here in the red. Now you're going to go, and remember, Zone 2 being 88 to 95% of run FTP. Now you're going to run for 10 minutes at 92%. Okay. And this is, again, the theory of how the workout is built. This is how it is defined for the specific athlete. And these are the intensity numbers that would appear on the athlete's watch and change in real time while they were running. What it's very nice for running with power. It's very, very nice for intervals. So this is an example of Zone 2 tempo intervals. Remember, again, 88 to 95% of run FTP. You have your warm-up portion, but really the two within the sections of the run that are circled by green are our tempo intervals, our Zone 2 intervals. And this running with wattage allows us to break that out very nicely and define it. So, if you look at the first interval here, the first interval, right, it's right here. It is defined, I break it up into the 15-minute interval. I break it up into two pieces, 11 minutes at, say, the lower half of zone 2, and then 4 minutes at the higher portion of zone 2, okay, with a nice little recovery period. And then we repeat again, okay? But it's a very nice tool to just draw some very clear distinctions, and there's no time trying to deal with getting heart rate up into an interval zone. There's no concern about terrain. Road pitch, is the road uphill, downhill, flat, with regards to worrying about trying to gauge intensity through pace. Wattage doesn't care. It just doesn't care what the terrain is. It's going to measure your effort no matter what the terrain is. So it would be very easy to take a zone 2 run, take these zone 2 intervals into the trails, okay, and be able to execute those right in a nice trail run, where if you were on the road, that those zone 2 intervals maybe would be paced at I don't know, let's call it 730s per mile for zone 2. And in the trails, you're not quite sure, because trail running is typically much slower, or somewhat slower than road running. It's more technical, and any climbs and descents can be more can be steeper, or I would call it more severe and more fluctuating than the road. And so it can be really difficult to utilize pacing in the trails, and power would allow you to do that very, very easily, because power just doesn't care. Best effort intervals. These are a great way to break up. So this is a workout of 400s and 800s. There are 6 400s all done at about 407 watts, say, and 800s, 3 800s done at 370 watts. And these are intervals that are well defined. So an athlete, regardless of their fitness, say, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, you can tell an athlete, say, just go out, you're going to run some 400s. Your best effort for 400s is 407 watts. Go do that, okay? And that may translate into 400s that are at 115, probably not, but it might translate into 115, or it might translate into best efforts that are more like 3 minutes, okay? It's totally dependent upon the athlete, where they are in their fitness, and it's just a very nice, and I would consider it easy way to define intensities. Okay, so how to determine run FTP? Okay, so all of this is very, very dependent. I'm talking all this kind of theory. It's very dependent on knowing what your functional threshold power is for 1 hour running. Okay, and one way to do that is to go out and do an hour-long test. Well, that would be hell. Okay, and you would probably not do that well. So there are 2 different tests that we utilize. One is probably a little more reliable in terms of defining an hour-long intensity than the other. But the other, this one, while a little less reliable, is maybe a little more executable and less threatening to an athlete who may be just getting into running with power. So the protocol for the test, it's a 3 minutes TT and a 9 TT. There's a warm up, at least 15 minutes preparing for a hard effort. Okay, you just basically you spend 15 minutes doing whatever it is that will prepare you for a run test. And then you run a 3 minute all out effort. okay, and you record your average wattage. And this particular athlete was me. I did this test. And when I ran all out for 3 minutes, I averaged 391 watts, okay? And then recovered with a very easy 3 minutes of light jogging and or walking. That was a long time, okay? But what it did was really ensure that I was ready to put out an all-out 9-minute effort, okay, at the end. It was a long time, though. I will admit to that. So then I did a 9-minute all-out TT effort. And for that, I averaged 368 watts. I recorded that average. And then the formula that we use is to basically take the sum of the 3-minute wattage and the 9-minute wattage, divide it by 2, and multiply it by 90%. Okay, so in my particular instance, it was 391 plus 368 equals 759. Divide that by 2 and take 90% of that, equal 342 watts. Okay, that's one style of testing. Another style of testing is the 30-minute TT, which initially sounded very threatening, and I actually did this one second about a month after I did the first TT, which was the 3 and 9, and because quite frankly, I was just afraid of this one. And so we warm up for 15 minutes. We run a 30-minute all-out effort on flat terrain, just to kind of keep things as normalized as possible. And we record our average wattage and heart rate if that's possible. What we do then is grab the average wattage for the final 20 minutes of the 30-minute TT. So here in the red, we are indicating the 30-minute test, okay? This was my effort for the 30 minutes. But what we do is we grab the final 20 minutes of that 30 minutes, okay? And that represents our run FTP. And that came out to be 338 watts. Now, that's less than the 342, right? And it was done a month after. So in theory, I should have been in better shape, correct? My fitness should have been better because I had a month of training. Now, there were a couple of things that would have defined some of the difference there. And excuse for the barking dog in the background. He just heard me do something, heard me shift. But one issue that kind of arises is that the 3-minute test, the 3-minute 9-minute test versus the 30-minute test. The 3-minute 9-minute is a significantly more aerobic type of effort. And it's anaerobic type of effort than the 30-minute test. And when measuring versus a 60-minute, what we're trying to extrapolate out from the testing is a 60-minute TT. The 30-minute effort is probably going to be, the 30/20-minute effort is probably going to be a better indicator of 60-minute effort. So while the 342 got me close, the 338 was probably more appropriate. And it is definitely something that I felt in my training. So once I had done this test about a month before the 30-minute test, I was utilizing 342 as my run FTP and defining all of my training zones based upon that number. And sometimes I would feel like the wattage that I was being told to run based upon the workout felt just a hair too much, just slightly a hair too much at times, and so that even though I was in better fitness, a month later when I did the 30-minute test, when I got to the 338 wattage, I felt that much. I felt just that like my run intensities were being defined in a more appropriate way, and I just want to check. And it just felt better. So that one thing that I think I've come to learn from and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, is that this is from my experience thus far with myself and with my athletes. And I am a very experienced runner, and each of my athletes are very experienced runners. Most of all of us who are going to be viewing this webinar are probably quite experienced runners, relatively speaking. Is that I have found that for experienced runners, as we become more fit, it is not necessarily the case that our run FTPs increase, okay? Which is counterintuitive when we think of running, and when we think of power. Because when we think of power, we think of the bike. And when we think of the bike, we think of getting stronger. And the whole idea is to make our biking FTP as big as possible. And I have found that is not necessarily the case with running FTP. What I have found to be the case instead is that the wattage zones remain the same. The running FTP remains the same. What happens instead is not that the number goes up, okay? Is that the paces that we are able to hold at any given wattage become faster, okay? And what we are doing instead is becoming much more efficient runners. And so that's where, and I think that's a little bit of disconnect. I have, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about things in a bit. That's a little bit of disconnect from our traditional kind of use of the word wattage in triathlon training, because we are so ensconced in bike power, okay? And I'm just finding running power to behave a little bit more like heart rate in that effect, okay? Once we have a threshold heart rate, it doesn't usually change very much. What happens instead is that we get faster at a given heart rate, okay? I'm finding that to be very similar with running wattage FTP. Once I have a running threshold wattage, the key to making it larger is not necessarily in becoming more fit. It's in a different arena, okay? But I may speak to that a little bit more. All right, so racing with power. This is where I have seen a ton of success with athletes. So basically, what becomes very easy is to define what our race intensities should be when running with power. Okay, and I'm going to bring us through a couple of examples of that. But wattage intervals. So interval training becomes very, very, very easy. So if we're going to do mile efforts per se, okay, so 1,600 meter efforts, we just dial into 102% of our FTP, our run FTP. Now remember, like I just said, it's my run FTP for the most part, I'm going to say, and that of my athletes, is not very different whether I am on day 2 of training versus if I'm on day 200 of training, okay? And that's because most of us tend to be pretty experienced athletes. If we were brand new to running, okay, this may be a very different story, and there may be room for FTP growth, okay? But typically speaking, I think we're going to exist at any given point. If my run FTP right now is 338 watts, in my worst fitness, I might be 334 watts. In my best fitness, I might be 341 watts. Not much change, okay? Probably mostly 338. And so what will change instead is if I go out and do mile repeats and I'm on day 2 of training, and I don't necessarily recommend that, but I'm going to go out and I'm going to run 102% of FTP. And for me at 338, that's going to be, say, probably 345 watts. So I'm going to go out and do a 3 by mile, 3 by a mile at 345 watts. And on day 2 of training, that may look like 8-minute mile repeats. Okay. On day 200 of training, when I am extremely fit, okay, I'm still going to go out and do mile repeats at 345 watts, except instead of it being at 8-minute pace, it's now maybe going to be at 6:45 pace, say, just making up numbers. And that is a very nice feature of running with power. Okay, it makes intensity very easy to define. And so these are just kind of, when in training, how we define the different intensities for a given interval. Okay, on race day, it's very similar. You're going to go run a 5K. You just dial into about 102% of run FTP. And this is assuming in the conditions in which you're training. Okay, there is some degradation. If you train at sea level, okay, and then you're going to go and run a 5K at 10,000 feet, these percentages would have to be degraded, okay, and brought down a bit. But that's a different discussion. If you are racing in the relative conditions in which you're training, same with heat. If you're training in 40-degree weather, but you're going to go run a 5K in 90-degree weather, 102% of run FTP may not be appropriate. You may want to bring that down a little bit. So 5-mile road race is at 100% of FTP, 10K at 99%, half marathon at 95%, a marathon at 89%, seeing a great deal of success there, a 50K at 87%. And this is where I believe, and that enters into the ultra world. A couple of years ago, one of my athletes was run, and this was before we had entered into the wattage world. My stride that I had received somehow, I don't even remember how or where, was sitting on my desk, doing nothing for 2 years before I even put it on my shoe. I wish I had known. I had an athlete who went and did the JFK 50 miler. And the thing with the JFK 50 miler is that it opens up, I believe, with about 15 miles of trail. And then it kind of dumps down into a canal for the next canal-ish setting, flat, not technical, for the next 35 miles. Okay. The thing was, we had no idea, in talking with the athlete, whether this first 15 miles of trail was going to be, like 10.5-minute mile type of trail or 21.5-minute type of trail. We're off-road, terrain changes may be significant. It may be very twisty single track. There may be rocks. We had no idea what we were walking into for those first 15 miles. And then we didn't know what kind of effect that was going to have on the next 35 miles after that. What would have been really nice is to have wattage and to have said, now it wouldn't have been at 87%. It probably would have been more along the lines of 81% of something like that of FTP. We could have just said, okay, your run FTP, I'm just going to use a very easy number, is 300. And for a 50 miler, that's going to be, maybe a 50 miler, which is off-road. So maybe it behaves a little more like a 100K. So maybe we should use something like a 77% of run FTP, just for round numbers at 300. Let's dial into about 220 watts for the day. So whether you are on the trail, the single track trail, or you're on that canal, that flat canal, you're just dialing into an even, steady intensity of 220, 230 watts. And that would have been a very nice tool to have for that. But instead, my power meter was sitting on my desk staring at me. Okay, so how do we pace a race with power? And I have 2 examples of a runner, same runner, who did Boston the October version of Boston, and then New York City in this past year. And both efforts ended up being, I guess, what I would call sub 3 hour pace. Okay. The athlete didn't actually go sub 3 hours because they ran further, that thing that happens when you run a race. These Boston qualifier courses have a perfect line that must be followed in order to run 26.2 miles. And in any race that has 20,000 people in it, it's going to be really challenging to follow anything close to that perfect line. So this athlete in both instances ended up running about 26.8 miles, which is a sub 3 hour effort for 26.2. Just doesn't look like it because they're stuck with the 26.8. Having said that, what we were able to do with the wattage was I was able to take the course outline, the elevation profile, and just break it down. Okay, kind of the idea being this athlete at a marathon is defined as 89% of run FTP. The athletes run FTP, I think, if I remember correctly, it was about 248 watts. And so that was going to put a goal average of about 215 watts for the marathon. Okay. If this marathon had been perfectly flat, like a Rotterdam type of race, we would have just said, okay, go and run at 215 watts. No matter what, just run at 215 watts. It would have been really easy, but it was Boston. And Boston has, for anyone who's run Boston, has the drop of the first 4 miles. And then it has a flat stretch for about 10 miles. And then it has the hills, the Newton Hills. And then the Newton Hills drop into Boston proper. It has a very fluctuating terrain. And so what we were able to do is break the course into sections, okay? Knowing that similar-ish to bike wattage, when you are running downhill, you are not going to be able to maintain, or it's gonna take more effort to maintain a higher wattage running downhill than if you're running on a flat or uphill. So taking that into account, on flats, you should just be able to dial in on the flats, and knowing that it's going to be easier to generate wattage going uphill. That doesn't mean the effort's going to be easier, that it's going to be easier to make that wattage number higher when going uphill. So you have to be careful, okay? So what we were able to do is break the course into sections. Remember, the goal average being 200, I have written there 216 watts. So I defined it as, okay, when we're on the flats, we're gonna want to run between 215, 220 watts. When we're on climbs, we want to go between 220 and 235 watts. When we're on descents, 195 to 210 watts. Okay, so on descents, we're going to keep our average on the lower side. We're going to keep our goal on the lower side. On the flats, we're going to be right around where we want to be. And on the climbs, we're going to allow ourselves to go a little higher than we maybe would, but because we're going to make up for it on the descents. Okay, so you can see in the first 4 miles, we said, okay, let's try to hold that at 195 to 210 watts. Then we entered that flat section. Section B I have here in the green. That is a nice flat, relatively flat zone that we have for the most part dialing into 215, 220. We got some hills, 225 to 235 flat, and then the heartbreak hills. And so we were able to break down, I'm not going to go through every single section. You can read it, but we were able to break down the course into different sections, and we had a theme for each type of section, right? And that becomes very easy to think about. And so on race day, again, this was an excellent effort. This turned out to be a sub 3 hour marathon, but it was imperfect. It could have been faster. And what happened was the athlete kind of struggled after Boston College. The quads, they got beat up by in the quads going down the hills here, which I've been there. But we're in a section where we had wanted the athlete to average between, this is broken into two sections. So this would have been this whole thing right here, where we would have wanted the athlete to be running between 200 and 210 and 215 to 220, say an average, just call an average of 210 over that section. The athlete was only able to generate an average of 197 watts. So we went back and looked and said, well, why did that happen? And in some further analysis, we realized that in the early section, okay, on the drop, okay, from the starting line to the first 4 miles right here, where we had wanted I'll call it cross-sectional wattage. Okay, this is a term that I think I have made up. Cross-sectional wattage being not your average wattage, but anytime you look down at your watch, you see something in this range. Okay, so that's what these are. Anytime you look down at your watch, you see something in this range of numbers. We had wanted this section to be cross-sectionally 195 to 210. What actually ended up happening was the average of that section was 210, which some of you may say, oh, well, that's perfect. That's just at the top end of that range. But that's where the disconnect is that in order for the average to have ended up at 210, that means that there had to have been significant time spent above 210. And that was a time when the athlete was generating heavy wattage when they didn't need to be. And that was basically that was like spent, right? That they mortgaged the back part of the race was mortgaged because of just a little too heavy early on, and it was very easy for us to pick that out. Okay, still I think it was 6:51 pace or 6, still a sub 3 hour effort. Okay, a great race. So 4 weeks later, maybe 3 weeks later, same athlete runs New York City. No real change in fitness whatsoever. Different course, but has similar challenges, say. And so no real fitness, same goal wattage, but that wouldn't have changed anyway. And we broke down the course. We take the course profile, break it down into the same kind of sections that we had before. On the flats, we want to run between 215 to 220. On the downhills, 195 to 210. We broke it all out, okay, per section, and each section had a theme. And the athlete did a really good job of sticking to it, okay? You'll note that the goal average on the Boston had been 216 watts. The athlete averaged 211, okay? Just did a really good job. Still, those 5 watts, we knew that there was speed in those 5 watts. In New York City, the athlete really nailed every section of this so much better. And again, we get to the point where we are kind of splitting hairs, but we're trying to squeeze as much speed out of this run as possible. Athlete averaged 214 watts, okay, and just a perfectly steady effort. This one ran further, right? So another 43.2 at Boston kilometers, 43.5 kilometers in New York City, average 649. I believe, if I remember correctly, it was the equivalent of a 256 and change for a 26.2 effort. So just an excellent run, and we were able to parse the effort out and through the wattage. Okay, and this is where it's very, very powerful stuff. Okay, so then this comes into triathlon, because this is supposed to be a triathlete's guide to running with power. Now, this is a really nice graphic that I don't know, it fell upon my eyes. I don't know how. I did not create this. If anybody knows where this came from, I would love for you to tell me. Please email me at tim@qt2systems.com so that I can give whoever created this due acknowledgement, because it's a very nice thing. I've used it with some of my athletes. So this is for 70.3 in Ironman pacing. And I had tested out, I hadn't done a 70.3 in order to be able to test any of the stuff out, but I had tested out racing a triathlon with wattage in an Olympic distance race that I did on the Cape this past summer. And if you recall, a 10K, an open 10K, okay, an open 10K allowed, you'd want to shoot for about 99% of run FTP. And I had initially aimed to do that in kind of some of my initial thinking. And then I realized, I'm running off the bike. I'm probably not going to be able to generate the same kind of effort. I had to be reasonable. I dialed it down to about 95% for the Olympics. I can't quite recall off the top of my head at the moment. But anyway, my point being, what I found was off of the bike, I had decided that I wanted to average 308 watts for the Olympic. And I went out, and right out of transition and in the first mile, I was right on par with 308 watts. And it felt like a very, very easy effort off of the bike in the Olympic distance triathlon. And what happened was, the beauty of running with power was it held me back early on. And so in a 10K, in the 10K off the bike, the first 4.5 miles started out quite easy and got slowly, progressively more difficult, such that really only the last mile was hard and felt hard, really hard. Whereas in the past, probably what I would have done is gone out at some indiscriminate pace, unknown. Okay, if I'm trying to gauge by moving speed, I don't know what the course is, how the course conditions are going to define that moving speed. I'm just kind of a little bit blind to things. I would probably tend to go out harder than I should, feel fine for about a mile and a half, and then probably suffer for the final 4.5 miles. This made it so I felt pretty reasonable for the first 4.5 miles, and really only suffered for the final mile. Probably ends up being a faster effort running with wattage, because there was significantly less fade than there would have been. I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent here. But this tool ends up being a very nice tool that I've used with a couple of athletes for 70.3 Ironman pacing. So on the left side of the tool, we have half iron distance. On the right side, we have a full distance. And then we take it down. Okay, so is this on a half distance? Are you a weak biker or a strong biker? If a weak biker, are you a weak runner or a strong runner? And so on. If a weak runner, 85% of run FTP. If a strong runner, 88% of FTP. Okay, and that's for 70.3. For full distance, slightly different. I'll take you through that very specific example. What I have found in triathlon is because running off the bike is more challenging, and you're just kind of worn out going into it, is that anytime you I'll talk about this after, but a good rule of thumb is if you are running along and you are supposed to be running at, say, 290 to 300 watts, but your effort is just not allowing you to get there, and you're only really able to get to 282 watts, say, and you just can't seem to get into that 290 to 300 range, there's something off with your form. And so what I'm having athletes do, particularly in triathlon, is start to count their steps, okay, and an increase in cadence. It's usually a good indicator. Wattage, not being able to generate the wattage that you should be generating, is a good indicator that there's something going on with your form. The form is breaking down, and that's real time that you can realize that. And it's usually ground contact time is starting to go through the roof. And so to combat that, you start to count your steps, which increases your cadence. Anyway, just a little rule of thumb. So this is a pacing that we built for an athlete who was racing Ironman Arizona. slightly undertrained for the event, but he took a chance with me and allowed me to pace him for the race with running wattage. He had never done it before. He was an athlete, so it's an Ironman distance, full distance. He is a strong biker, tends to be a weaker runner. Not to say that he's a weak runner, but just he's a weaker runner. And so that defined that he should be paced in the 78 to 80% of run FTP range, which for him, with a run FTP of 308 watts, was 245 to 250. Okay, so what we defined as for the Ironman, we said, okay, cross-sectionally, again, cross-sectional wattage being defined as not the average, but anytime you look down at your watch, you see a number between 235 and 250 when running, okay? And we know that, you know, the goal here was 245 to 250, but because this is an Ironman, you know, there are times when you're feeling fairly decent in an Ironman, and there are times when you feel like absolute hell in an Ironman. And so I wanted to open up the range a little bit so that if he were to be running, you know, the 245 to 250 was looking more like 240, you know, but he's battling close. I didn't want his mental game to slip up where he felt like he sucked because he was only able to generate 240. He can't quite get to 245, and that can just kind of spiral somebody out of mental control, say, and kind of ruin a day. I wanted to open up the range for him so that when he wasn't feeling amazing, he could sit down around 235 to 240. When he was feeling better, it would put him in a position to be able to push up towards 250. Okay. The athlete ended up averaging for the whole run, and you can see, so what we had was you're going to run for portions, you're going to walk for portions. When you are running, you're going to run for, you know, between 235 and 250. So you're going to run for a mile. I think we defined it, I'm sorry, as every aid station, he would walk through the aid station, the length of the aid station, a power walk, get his fuel, and then resume running again. And he wasn't to worry about wattage when walking. And so his average for the entire portion of running, for the entire portion of the run, so the full 26.2 miles, was 235, okay? Which included the walks. That equated to a 3:53 marathon, which for this athlete in the training that he had done going to the event was a best case scenario. He absolutely nailed it. Any sample of these running sections, okay, these running section, those tended to be in the 240 to 245 range, okay? So he absolutely nailed it. And I give credit to the wattage that he was using, and really dialed into it, trusted it. The wattage held him back early on, okay, because left to his own devices, he probably would have run these early portions of the run, probably in the 245 to 260 range, and that probably would have felt fine until, you know, about halfway through, and then there would have been a slow or maybe fast degradation that occurred with a bunch of walking. But the running with wattage it gave him a tangible thing to look at, a concrete number to look at, no matter what the terrain was doing, that gauged his intensity most appropriately. So that's an example of how it really worked well in an Ironman, particularly for an undertrained athlete. It helped him to pace appropriate to where he was. Okay, so I consider this to be the first phase of this presentation. I think of running with power for a triathlete. I'm going to want to do a second presentation at some point, because what power does, I am finding, is allow us to see inside of the runner. And this is kind of the piece that starts to, I think, differentiate running with power for a triathlete versus running with power for a runner. And so there are 4 primary metrics that the power meter looks at. I have really gotten pretty involved with and enamored with one in particular called form power ratio. I have not yet taken the same deep dive into vertical oscillation, ground contact time, and LSS. Okay, and so we're going to look right now at this metric called form power ratio, and we're going to discuss, or I'm going to discuss, how it informs how a triathlete should how I believe a triathlete should think about running. And it really helped me to define how it helped me to help adjust my own running as I've gotten older. Okay, so form power ratio. Form power ratio, what is it? Form power ratio is the wattage required to run in place. Okay, if you recall, wattage is defined within three planes: the horizontal plane, the vertical plane, and then a rotational plane. Okay, form power ratio basically takes out the horizontal plane from running. Okay, so imagine you're running in place. That is form power. I'm sorry, that is form power. Form power. Okay. So the best example I can give is somebody who is somebody who marches in place. Okay, they have no horizontal component to their movement, and it's only up and down and maybe a little bit of rotation to them. Their form power would be their form power ratio would be high. I'll get into that. They have very little horizontal movement, so total average power would be low. Okay, so if their vertical component of their wattage would be their total wattage, if the summation of horizontal, vertical, and rotational, would be void of the horizontal component, so it would be lower. Okay, I think I did this out of order. So what is form power ratio? Form power ratio is basically the ratio of what it takes for you to run in place, okay, divided by your normal average power. Okay, if you're actually running, and the ratio, generally speaking, the lower that is, the better. Okay, and what does that mean? So I'll get into this a bit, but a person who marches in place is going to have a very high form power ratio. Okay, they're going to have a lot of up and down movement. Okay, form power ratio, to think about it, is the vertical component of your running divided by the vertical plus horizontal plus rotational. Okay, the best example of somebody who with what I would consider to be almost perfect form power ratio would be the speed skater. Okay, the speed skater will tend to have very little vertical component, very little. This vertical piece would be close to zero. Okay, close to zero, and their horizontal piece and rotational piece would be pretty high. So a very small number divided by a larger number would be a very small number. Okay, so form power very low. Most power is generated over the horizontal plane. Their form power ratio would be very low. And this is an athlete who moves just in a very horizontal direction. Okay, that should make sense to everybody. I know that I'm talking. If we just zoom back, and slow it down for a second, our goal is to move as quickly as possible through the horizontal plane, right? And so anytime that we spend up in the air in the vertical plane must be benefiting our horizontal plane for it to be beneficial to us, correct? So any vertical component to our running that doesn't benefit, that isn't used in some way to further our horizontal component of running, is no bueno. Okay, is inefficiency. Okay, so one of the better runners that I've seen, despite his height, I would say, is with regards to form power ratio. If you get an opportunity, go on YouTube and watch Usain Bolt run just about anything, 100 or 200. What you'll see is very little knee drive that goes up. Okay, all of his knee quote unquote knee work is very horizontal. His knees are quite low relative to the speed that he is running. He is in one singular direction. So his form power ratio is likely to be very, very low. Tremendous wattage generated over the horizontal plane with minimal over the vertical plane. I highly recommend that you go on YouTube and check out some and watch him run specifically, and watch this knee plane. This knee plane is very horizontal with very little component in the vertical direction. Okay. And for QT2, what I have found is that for zone R, so a typical, the lower the better with this form power thing that I'm talking about. I know it's a little confusing, okay, but what we'll typically see is a form power ratio in the range of somewhere between 0.2 and 0.3 as being what I would consider to be pretty good. Anything that ends up going above 0.3, and again, that's vertical component divided by total average, is going to translate more into, I would say, wasted energy. Okay. And so our goal ends up being to try and bring the form power ratio down. Okay. So for a recovery run, I like to see, the lower the better. Okay. Absolutely, the lower the better, no matter what. But I guess I would consider these to be acceptable ranges. And this is not, form power ratios are not, this is not a metric that you can see in Training Peaks. It's a metric that you can only see in the Stride software, the Stride app on your phone. So 0.28 to 0.3 for zone R, for zone 1, 0.26 to 0.28, for zone 2, 0.24 to 0.26, for zone 3, 0.23 to 0.25. For best effort, 10K and under, 0.21 to 0.22. And for best effort, half marathon to marathon, 0.22 to 0.24. An athlete who I know ran a half marathon this weekend with a power meter, and their form power ratio came up to be 0.23, which is excellent. And that means that they were running in a very efficient way. And what we'll typically see oftentimes, and these numbers are what I'm finding with athletes, and as we collect more and more data, that they are negatively impacted by heat and humidity. Each year, I would go to Florida for our training camps, and I would spend a month in Florida. And while I was in Florida, I would train. I would do my own training and go for runs, and I would always find myself each year leaving February. I guess I would call it beat up. My knees really hurt. The runs were really, really taking a toll on me. And this past year, I spent a little bit of time in Florida, not as much as normal. And while I was there, I paid a little more attention to my running metrics, because I had not been using power when I had been in Florida last. And what I found was that my form power ratio in Florida was much higher than it had been at home, and home being Boston. And so in Boston, I had left Boston running in 25 to 35 degree weather, and gone down to Florida and been running at in 65 to 80 degree weather. That heat, that change in temperature, I should say, was probably causing me to if at home my zone 1 runs, I was falling in at 0.26, say. In Florida, I was falling in more at like 0.28, and I'm getting beat up. I'm just not feeling as good about my running. I'm more sore. And what I had always felt that when I was in Florida, and this was before running with power, that I was landing on my heels. Going back and looking at the data this past year, with the form power ratios being so different while in Florida versus when I had been at home, that there was this kind of slip from 0.26 to 0.28 suggested that there was a greater vertical component to my running. And so I was spending more time up and down, driving force into the ground without necessarily getting a horizontal benefit from it. So, and since I've really taken a good, every run I do, I think about trying to drive my form power ratio as low as possible. I cannot see it while I'm running, okay? But when I run, and this is what the power of running with wattage, no pun intended, has done for me, is to make it so that after 30 years of competitive running, I see running in terms of planes. When I'm running down the road, I am thinking about, am I getting the most horizontal bang for the buck out of this run? Am I wasting time going up and down in my runs? And what has occurred is my form power ratio from when I started running, when I first discovered this, to now, and really focusing on it in a very conscious way, has plummeted from, say, 0.31 down to sometimes in zone 1, 0.25. And that has, what is occurring is A, I'm becoming faster, and B, more importantly, I am less beat up. Each run beats me up less because I'm driving less force and power into the ground. Okay. And it's interesting for we triathletes. One thing that happens, I think, with we triathletes, which is different than a normal runner, is we triathletes try to think of our running like as if we're runners. We are not runners. We are triathletes, and we have to kind of maybe run a little bit differently than we would if we were, purely runners. In the same way that a time trialist on a bike, the bikes look the same. A pure cycling time trialist who does not have to run after they time trial, the bike looks very similar to a triathlete's bike, but it is fit very differently. They are going to tend to be further back on the seat because they are really trying to utilize muscles, much larger muscles, in very powerful ways than a triathlete does. A triathlete's more forward because they want to use some of the muscles, but they also want to preserve their legs for running. So they want the aerodynamic benefit of being in an aerodynamic position, but they want to be careful with the muscle usage because they're going to have to use the same set of muscles to run. A pure cyclist doesn't have to worry about that. They just generate wattage. So those are, in the same way that those two things are different and they're thought about in different ways. A triathlete is a different runner than a runner. And so I think what happens oftentimes is that the triathlete, and I'm using my cursor here, so please follow along as best you can, is so tight in the hip flexor area, okay? So tight from being in the aero position so much that when we think like we're a runner, we actually end up thinking that, okay, I want to generate my speed by lifting my knee up and out to get that, to get as much horizontal component as possible. But what happens is, because we're so tight in this region, our up really goes up, like straight up. It doesn't really have the out component. If you can see my cursor, you can see I'm driving at an angle. The goal is to get that knee out and up. Up and out. When what happens is, because of the tightness, it really just goes up. And when it goes up, it just comes down. Okay. And so as triathletes, we probably have to think a little differently about how we're trying to generate our power. And so to drive the knee more forward. And it may sound a little bit more like a shuffle. And I don't mean to give it a bad word, a bad name like that, but effective triathlon running is probably going to look a little more, a little shuffleish, more so than typical normal running. I'm trying to think of a very good example of somebody who runs it. Actually a very good example is Chrissy Wellington was a very good example of somebody who could run a 3-ish hour marathon off the bike, and yet her strides generated very little, again back to the cursor, very little knee drive up and out. Okay, it was a very horizontal motion with the knee drive. And I would recommend or invite you to go and check out some Chrissy Wellington videos from running in Kona and see what she's doing in with specifically with her running stride, and very little wasted energy in that. And so she's going to fatigue less. She's going to, the lower that these numbers, that these form power ratios can be, means there's less up and down occurring with her run. She's getting beat up less, and that thing makes a big difference in the second half of an Ironman marathon. This is an alternative way I have found to hone in on Run FTP. It's kind of this is for an athlete who has no real FTP data for running. They are oftentimes not in quite a spot to do a run test. Maybe they're coming back off of a little bit of injury and it's not worth the stress. Maybe the test itself just feels mentally threatening. And so what I'll do instead is have an athlete do a decent set of runs, say 5 to 10 runs. And if I can find a set of runs that are fought where the form power ratios are falling in the 0.26 to 0.29 range, then I will treat the wattage associated with those runs as their mid-zone 1 wattage, which is 84% of Run FTP. And then use that to back into a Run FTP. Okay, and this may be a little out there, but so for example, a set of runs where the form power ratios are falling right around 0.28 to 0.29 at an average wattage of 220 watts, say, I'll assume that 220 watts represents their mid-zone 1, okay? And so that's defined as 84% of Run FTP. I'll take that 220, I'll divide by 0.84, and I'll settle in on a Run FTP of 262 watts, which gives me a good, starting point until such time that we can get some alternative data to maybe have a more accurate Run FTP. Okay, that's just a kind of a backwards way in. I think this is my last slide. Yeah. Okay. So some initial conclusions and hypotheses about running with power. So as I said before, experienced runners will see very little increase in their Run FTP. What happens instead is that their pace at any given wattage gets faster. Okay. They just become significantly more efficient. Okay. So like I said, 200 watts when they first start running may look like 10-minute miles, and 12 weeks may look like 8:45s. Okay. An increase in FTP, and this goes into what I was talking about earlier. I'm gonna have to go back, but increase in FTP is not going to come from a fitness gain. It is going to come from an increase in the range of motion. Okay, so as I talked about earlier, we triathletes, where we are so tight in the hip flexor region, the body work that we can do to open up this, so that if we were to try to drive the knee up and out, okay, would actually have an up and out component to it rather than up, that is where we are going to be able to really develop an improvement or an increase in our Run FTP. So it's going to come less from fitness and more from improving our body's range of motion. Okay, and that is essentially that's body work. That's rolling. That's massage. That's Normatex, Hyperice. All of that stuff are the ways in which we're going to preserve or increase our range of motion. And what we'll see, what I'm finding is the older athletes who I work with, their run FTP is lower, is definitely lower than a younger athlete, and that makes good sense. All right, but the real question is why. And I think a decent piece of why, not the whole piece, but a decent piece of why, is because as we get older, our range of motion diminishes or decreases, and that is kind of a driving factor with the run FTP, because running power is a function of the three planes: horizontal, vertical, and rotational. Let's see. Unless you are running a sub 130, 70.3, or sub 310, or approximate, that's not sub, I'm sorry, approximate 310 Ironman marathon or better, I would consider the super shoes. Okay, so the Nikes, you know the shoes I'm talking about. To be probably not a very good equipment choice for runners who are not running at those very high speeds. They're a very good choice for runners who are running that fast. But what happens for runners who are running more slowly is that their form power ratios, and if we go back to my example here, their form power ratios are going to tend to be higher, which means they are falling. They have a greater vertical component in their running than the athletes who are running faster, and the greater vertical component usually comes in with a tendency to land on the heel, and those shoes tend not to be. Those shoes are made to be run on the forefoot, and so for that reason, as long as you are gonna, those shoes are good for any distance where you are going to stay on your forefoot. Okay, as soon as you start falling back and away from the forefoot, those shoes become less and less ideal. Okay, so that's just a noticing that I've had. It's probably more of a hypothesis, but that's again, like I said, FPR, so form power ratio, tends to increase as temperature increases because the runner is landing further back on his or her heels. Okay, so that's all I got. I don't know if anyone has any questions or what. I'm open to anything.
Hey, Tim, I got a question.
Okay.
The mobility to help, gain efficiency and potentially boost your FTP. What would you say, instead of just generically saying massage, Normatec, Hyperice, are there any specific things that we could do to help either preserve or increase FTP, specifically in kind of like range of motion work? Like what exactly would you recommend?
Self-abuse. So
well, that's every day with you.
Get yourself a softball and lay on it so that it's just really digging into the hip flexor. And what is the name of that muscle that runs in the abdomen, right by the hip flexor? It's that anytime you get a deep tissue massage, when they go after it, you become nearly violent towards the psoas is the calf, right? Yeah, it sounds like that. It sounds like psoas. I just cannot recall it at this time. But you get the point, right? So you're really rolling out that area, trying to open that up as much as possible. I would say things like suspended lunges are really a good opener for those. Where I would say with a TRX, say with a foot forward and a foot within the straps, and just stretching out in a forward lunge position, really stretching out that hip flexor would be huge. Now back to the psoas, really making sure the calves are good and flexible, not too tight, so that you can get good drive from the calf. Yeah, I think those are probably the primary areas that I would recommend. And then also recognizing the fact that on the bike, not to say that we should all be sitting upright. I'm not trying to say that at all, but that I think it's often felt like that, I want to get as low as possible. That lower is better. And that's not necessarily so. Lower may be more aerodynamic, maybe, not necessarily, but at what cost? And if that cost is to not allow you to generate as much wattage, but you're more aerodynamic, great. But if a piece of that cost is also to further tighten up that hip flexor region, which then affects the running, then it's a kind of a double whammy in that department, right? So and I'm not saying that everybody should throw spacers on their bike and be upright. I'm not trying to say that, but just to be aware that it's not necessarily better to be lower on the bike. Hope that answers the question. Anyone have any other questions? Nope, doesn't sound like it. If not, thank you everybody for joining. I owe a second presentation on this topic, and like I had talked about around these three metrics: vertical oscillation, ground contact time, and this metric called LSS, which has something to do with muscle elasticity. I'm just not that well versed in those three. When I've done that, when I have a better understanding of those three things, then I'll be back.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.